The boxes were still stacked in precarious towers around Michael's new living room, the result of a long, exhausting day of unpacking and arranging. He glanced around at the half-empty shelves, the boxes labeled kitchen and books lying untouched. It was late, his stomach growling from neglect, and the thought of cooking in his still cluttered kitchen was less than appealing. He sighed and reached for his phone. Pizza it is, he muttered, scrolling through the local options until he found a nearby joint with good reviews. Clicking through the app, he placed his order, then settled back onto his couch, the silence of his new home settling around him. Moving was always strange, leaving one life behind and starting anew, and he found himself wondering if this new place would ever feel like home. About 20 minutes later, a soft but firm knock echoed from his front door. He rose, his mind on autopilot, expecting the usual quick exchange of a hot pizza and a brief thank you, but as he opened the door, he froze, his gaze locking on the delivery driver. She wasn't like any delivery driver he'd ever seen, or any person, for that matter. Her skin was a dusky, smooth shade of violet, like the early evening sky, and it had a soft, subtle luminescence that shimmered under the porch light. Her eyes were large, almond-shaped, and a striking shade of silver that seemed to catch the light in a way that was almost magnetic. She wore a standard delivery uniform, black cap, logoed shirt, and khaki pants, but there was something about the way she held herself that hinted at a mystery beyond the mundane. Michael's mouth opened and closed as he struggled to find his words. Hi. The woman offered a small, amused smile, tilting her head slightly as though she were used to this kind of reaction. Hello. Pizza for Michael. Her voice had a strange, lilting quality, her accent unfamiliar yet pleasant to his ears. She extended the box toward him, and he reached out, his hand brushing against hers briefly as he took it. Her skin was unexpectedly warm, and he felt a sudden jolt, like static electricity, shoot up his arm. Thank you, he stammered, realizing he was staring. Sorry, You look. She raised an eyebrow, her expression one of mild amusement. I look different. Yeah, not in a bad way. Just different, he winced, feeling his cheeks heat up as he mentally berated himself for his awkwardness. Way to be smooth, Michael. She chuckled, a soft, almost musical sound, and he noticed her expression softened slightly. I'm used to it. There aren't many of us out here yet. I'm Tira, by the way. Tira, he repeated, savoring the name. It suited her somehow. I'm Michael. Nice to meet you, Michael, she said, her gaze holding his for a moment that felt far longer than it was. I'm glad I got your order tonight. It's not often I meet someone who actually looks me in the eye. The words struck him, and he felt a pang of empathy. He could only imagine the kinds of stares she must attract in her line of work. But there was a warmth in her gaze, an openness that made him want to know more, to ask questions he was sure she'd been asked 100 times before. Can I ask where you're from? The question tumbled out before he could stop himself. Quite far, she replied, a hint of mystery in her smile. A place you wouldn't find on any of your maps. She looked around at the quiet suburban street, her expression briefly wistful. Earth's been interesting so far. Very different. I bet, he said, not wanting to press her but unable to help himself. Are you here permanently? Tira's smile faded slightly, and she seemed to contemplate the question. I don't know yet, she said honestly. I came here because I wanted something new. Something fresh, she shrugged, glancing down at the pizza box, as if it somehow held the answers. But it's not easy being different. Michael nodded, feeling a strange sense of connection to her words. He, too, had come here seeking a new start, hoping to leave behind parts of himself he no longer wished to carry. I get that, he murmured. Sometimes, a change of scenery is just what you need. For a moment, they stood in companionable silence, and he realized with a start that he didn't want the conversation to end. But he couldn't exactly invite her inside, not when she was just the delivery driver, even if she did seem like something more. Well, she said finally, breaking the silence, I should get going. Lots of pizzas to deliver tonight. Oh, right, he replied, a pang of disappointment flaring unexpectedly. Of course. Thanks again, Tira. She gave him one last smile, a soft, lingering look that seemed to say she understood what he couldn't put into words. "Take care, Michael." And with that, she turned and walked back to her car, her form casting long shadows under the streetlights. Michael stood at the doorway, watching her leave, feeling oddly bereft as her car pulled away. Once she was gone, he stepped back inside, closing the door behind him. He set the pizza on the counter, but he found he'd lost his appetite, the warm, savory aroma doing little to distract him from the surreal encounter he'd just had. Leaning against the counter, he let out a deep breath. "Did that ... actually happen?" he whispered to himself, glancing toward the door, as if he half expected her to appear again. He tried to push the encounter from his mind, chalking it up to nothing more than a strange, fleeting interaction. After all, he'd never see her again, right? But as he lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, he found that the thought of Tira lingered. He kept picturing her silver eyes, the way her skin glowed softly in the dim light, the warmth in her voice as she spoke to him. There was something about her, a quiet strength, an undeniable grace that had left a mark on him, a sense of wonder that made him feel like he'd glimpsed something beyond the ordinary. Michael turned over, pulling the blanket up to his chin as he closed his eyes. But Tira's face stayed in his mind, her voice like a melody echoing through his thoughts. Where was she from? Why had she come to Earth? He wanted to know more, to ask her 100 questions that had risen in his mind only after she'd left. But what were the chances he'd ever see her again? As he drifted off to sleep, he found himself hoping that somehow, against all odds, their paths would cross once more. Far from his thoughts, Tira drove through the quiet streets, her own mind lost in contemplation. She was used to the stares, the whispered questions, the quick glances that turned away. But Michael had looked at her differently, like he was seeing her, not just her unusual features. It was rare for anyone on this planet to meet her gaze with such open curiosity, and rarer still for them to speak to her with such kindness. She found herself smiling as she drove, the thought of him lingering longer than she'd anticipated. For a fleeting moment, she wondered if she'd made a mistake, coming here to a world where she didn't quite belong, where each day brought challenges she hadn't anticipated. But tonight, for the first time since she'd arrived on Earth, she felt a glimmer of something she'd almost forgotten: hope. And as she pulled up to the next house, readying herself for another delivery, she couldn't help but wonder if perhaps fate had more in store for her than she'd expected. Michael sat at his kitchen table, his fingers drumming on the wood as he stared at his phone screen. It had been 3 days since he'd met her, the delivery driver with the violet skin and silver eyes. Tira. He repeated her name in his mind, as though saying it silently could summon her. He'd replayed their brief encounter countless times, fixating on every detail, every word she'd said, even the way her voice had sounded: soft, musical, slightly mysterious. He had barely slept the last few nights. His thoughts tugged back to that single moment of connection. Was he just being foolish? Maybe he'd imagined the entire thing. But no matter how he tried to rationalize it, the memory of her stayed with him, refusing to fade. Part of him, the sensible part, told him to let it go. But another part, a quieter, deeper part, whispered to him that he might never forgive himself if he didn't try to see her again. So he opened the pizza app once more, his thumb hovering over the order button. He hesitated, feeling a strange mix of excitement and embarrassment. This is ridiculous, he thought, scolding himself. But he couldn't deny the spark of hope that flickered inside him. Taking a deep breath, he placed his order, this time choosing the same toppings he'd ordered last time, as if that might increase his chances of seeing her again. And then he waited, each minute dragging by as he sat by the window, straining to hear the sound of a car approaching. He checked his watch several times, wondering if he'd overestimated the delivery time, when finally he heard the unmistakable sound of tires on gravel. He leapt up, trying to compose himself, to look casual, even though his heart was pounding. The knock at his door felt like a reverberation in his chest. Taking a deep breath, he opened it, and there she was. Tira stood there, holding the pizza box, her silver eyes widening slightly in recognition. Her lips curved into a surprised smile, her gaze meeting his with an intensity that made him forget to breathe for a moment. "Michael," she said softly, as though they were old friends. "Hi, Tira," he managed to keep his voice steady, but he could feel the excitement bubbling beneath the surface. Her smile grew, and for a moment she seemed almost shy, shifting her weight slightly as she handed him the pizza box. "I wasn't expecting to see you again," she admitted, her voice carrying a hint of warmth that hadn't been there before. "Yeah," he faltered, feeling silly for not having a better explanation. "I just really liked the pizza," he chuckled, feeling his cheeks flush, but she only laughed softly in response. "Well, I'm glad you enjoyed it," she paused, glancing down at her hands, which were twisting the edges of her delivery bag. "Actually, my shift just ended. I saw your address come up, and well, I volunteered to take it." She looked up at him, her gaze vulnerable and open. The admission caught him off guard, sending a surge of warmth through him. She had wanted to see him again, too. The realization emboldened him, and before he could second-guess himself, he blurted out, "Would you like to come inside? I mean, since your shift is over and all." Tira hesitated, her expression shifting to one of surprise mixed with curiosity. She glanced over her shoulder, as if checking to make sure no one was watching, then turned back to him with a smile. "I'd like that." Michael stepped aside, allowing her to enter, suddenly acutely aware of the mess of half-unpacked boxes and scattered belongings. "Sorry about the clutter. I just moved in, and I haven't had the energy to unpack everything yet." "It's fine," she said, her voice gentle, reassuring. It makes the place feel lived in. Her gaze traveled around the room, taking in his mismatched furniture and the stacks of books lining the walls. They moved to the kitchen, where Michael set the pizza box down on the table and gestured for her to sit. He grabbed a couple of plates and drinks, feeling strangely nervous as he sat across from her. For a moment they sat in silence, an unspoken tension hanging in the air. He took a breath, breaking the quiet. "So, I don't mean to be intrusive, but I can't help being curious. What's it like, being here, on Earth?" She considered the question, her expression turning thoughtful. "It's complicated," she began slowly, as though carefully selecting her words. "I came here a year ago, hoping to experience a different way of life. On my planet, everyone's life is mapped out, expected. There's little room for exploration, for individual choice. Earth felt like it offered something different, something exciting." Her eyes softened, a wistful look crossing her face. "But it hasn't been easy. People stare. They're afraid of what they don't understand. And I understand that it's only natural. But it's hard sometimes, feeling like you're always on the outside, looking in." Michael nodded, feeling a pang of empathy. He'd felt like an outsider himself after his recent move, struggling to adjust, though his experiences seemed trivial in comparison to what Tira must have gone through. "I can't imagine what that's like. But I think it's amazing that you had the courage to come here in the first place." Tira gave him a soft smile, a touch of gratitude in her gaze. "Thank you." It helps to hear that she hesitated, her silver eyes studying him intently. "Most people just ask questions about where I'm from or what I can do. They're fascinated, but they don't really listen." The sincerity in her voice struck him deeply. She wasn't just an alien in a strange world, she was someone seeking connection, understanding. In that moment he felt an overwhelming urge to be that person for her, to offer her a sense of belonging that he knew she longed for. They ate in silence for a while, each absorbed in their thoughts, the unspoken connection between them growing stronger. Finally, Tira spoke, her voice quiet. "What about you, Michael? Why did you move here?" Michael hesitated, feeling vulnerable, but strangely willing to share. "I went through a rough breakup. I guess I wanted to start over, to put some distance between myself and the memories that were weighing me down. I needed a fresh start, even if it meant being alone." Tira nodded slowly, her gaze softening. "It's funny," she said, a hint of irony in her tone. "We're from different worlds, but we're both here for the same reason." A warmth spread through him, and he found himself smiling. "I guess we are." For the next hour, they shared pieces of themselves, small stories, personal quirks, dreams, and fears. Tira told him about her home, describing the vast, blue-green forests of her planet, the towering crystalline mountains that sparkled under twin moons. She spoke of the night sky back home, filled with unfamiliar constellations, and how Earth's own stars reminded her of distant memories. Her voice wove a tapestry of colors and sensations that Michael found himself enchanted by, as if he were seeing her world through her eyes. In turn, he shared stories of his favorite places on Earth, the trips he'd taken, the music he loved, and the novels he cherished. She listened with rapt attention, her eyes alight with curiosity as he described sights she had yet to see: rolling fields of lavender in Provence, the vast desert sands of the Sahara, the bustling streets of New York City. Eventually, the hour grew late, and the conversation slowed, a comfortable silence settling between them. Michael found himself reluctant to see her go, though he knew she couldn't stay forever. "Thank you for inviting me in," she said, standing and giving him a soft, sincere smile. "It's been a while since I've felt this at ease." "Anytime," he replied, meaning every word. "You're welcome here whenever you want." As she walked to the door, she hesitated, looking back at him with an expression that seemed to hold 1,000 unsaid things. "Good night, Michael," she said softly. "Good night, Tira." He watched her leave, her form casting a shadow as she stepped into the night, her movements graceful and quiet. He closed the door behind her, feeling a sense of loss, as though something precious had slipped from his grasp. But as he turned to the empty room, he realized he wasn't as alone as he had been. In that brief encounter, in those shared stories and stolen glances, he had found a connection, one that transcended the boundaries of worlds and the expectations of society. It was the beginning of something profound, something he couldn't yet name but knew he wanted to explore. And as he lay in bed that night, staring into the darkness, he found himself hoping that this wouldn't be the last time he saw her. He wanted to know her, to understand her story, to share his own. For the first time in a long time, he felt as if his new life held a spark of possibility, a flicker of light in the vast unknown. And somewhere, driving through the quiet streets, Tira felt the same warmth in her heart, a sense of belonging she hadn't known she was missing, and a newfound desire to return to the place where, for the first time on this strange new planet, she'd felt truly seen. Days drifted by, each one a strange blend of routine and anticipation for Michael. Since that evening when he'd shared pizza and stories with Tira, he found himself looking forward to her messages and phone calls as if they were lifelines, small moments of brightness in his days. He'd often find himself checking his phone, wondering if she'd texted or called, a quiet thrill building each time he saw her name light up his screen. Their conversations were like the slow unfolding of a rare, beautiful flower, each word, each story a new petal revealing itself, building a mosaic of understanding between them. The calls started casual, short exchanges that usually began with Tira telling him about her day, her work delivering pizzas, her encounters with strange and sometimes rude customers. But they grew longer, gradually peeling away the layers of politeness and reaching into deeper, uncharted territory. One evening, as Michael sat in his dimly lit living room, he picked up the phone and called her. The moment she answered, he felt a strange warmth, like he'd come home after a long, exhausting journey. Her voice was soft, as though she'd been waiting for his call too. "Hey, Tira," he said, his voice carrying a warmth that seemed to echo through the phone line. "How was your day?" "It was better now," she replied, a hint of amusement in her tone. "No rude customers tonight. I had a chance to see the city lights from a rooftop during a break. They looked like stars, only somehow closer. It reminded me of home." Michael listened, trying to imagine her standing alone on a rooftop, her violet skin illuminated by the twinkling lights of the city. He could almost see her silver eyes reflecting the glow, her mind somewhere far away, drifting through memories of her home planet. "Tell me about home," he said gently, hoping she would feel comfortable enough to share more of herself with him. There was a pause on the other end of the line, a delicate silence as she seemed to consider his request. "It's different from here. In some ways, it's even hard to describe." Her voice was thoughtful, tinged with a note of sadness. "The air is warmer, filled with the scent of things that don't exist here: flowers that change colors as they bloom, trees with leaves that shimmer under two suns. Nights there are softer, I guess. I never realized how much I'd miss it until I came here." Michael closed his eyes, letting her words paint a picture in his mind. Her world sounded like a dream, a place he could scarcely imagine. "It sounds beautiful," he murmured, feeling a strange ache, as if he too could feel the distance between her and her home. "It is," she replied, her voice dropping to a whisper. "But it's a place that doesn't leave room for much. Individuality. Everyone has a role, a purpose, and you're expected to follow it. I wanted more than that. I wanted to see the universe, to experience the unexpected. Earth offered me that." She paused, and he could sense a vulnerability in her voice. "I just didn't realize it would come with so much. Isolation." The words hung in the air between them, and Michael felt an ache in his chest. He understood that feeling all too well, the need to escape, to reinvent oneself, only to discover that the cost of that freedom was loneliness. "I get that," he said softly. "I moved here hoping to start over, to leave behind things I wanted to forget. But sometimes I wonder if I'll ever feel at home again." Tira was silent for a moment, as if absorbing his confession. "It's strange," she said finally, "but talking to you. It makes me feel like I'm not so far away from home. Like maybe I can belong somewhere, even here." Her words settled in his heart, bringing a warmth he hadn't felt in years. "I'm glad you feel that way. I feel it too." They continued talking, the minutes stretching into hours, until the night grew quiet around them. Their conversations wove a tapestry of shared dreams and unspoken longings, each word a thread drawing them closer together. As the days passed, their calls became a nightly ritual. Michael found himself looking forward to the end of each day, when he could hear Tira's voice, listening to her stories about her explorations of the city, her thoughts about human customs, and even her frustrations with the challenges she faced on Earth. One night, during one of their usual calls, Tira's voice carried a hint of weariness, an edge that he hadn't heard before. "Michael," she began, her voice hesitant, as though she were struggling to find the right words. "There's something I haven't told you." He sat up, his heart tightening with concern. "What is it?" She sighed, the sound heavy with resignation. "I've decided to quit my job at the pizza place." What the news caught him off guard. "Why?" Tira's tone grew soft, almost defeated. "It's the customers, Michael. Most people treat me like I'm an oddity. They either stare or avoid looking at me altogether. Some even refuse to take their orders from me. It's exhausting, being reminded every day that I don't belong." She paused, her voice growing quiet. "I've tried to ignore it, but it wears on you after a while." Michael felt a surge of anger on her behalf, a desire to protect her from the world's judgment. "I'm so sorry, Tira. I can't imagine how hard that must be." She let out a soft, bitter laugh. "I thought I could handle it, but I don't think I can anymore." There was a long pause before she spoke again. "The problem is, I don't know how I'll pay my rent now. I've been saving, but it won't last me long." Michael's heart ached at the thought of her struggling, of her feeling so alone in a place that didn't accept her. And before he could stop himself, the words slipped out. "Come stay with me." The silence on the other end of the line was palpable. He could almost feel her shock, the way his offer hung in the air, like a fragile promise. "Tira," he continued, his voice earnest, "I have a spare room. It's not much, but you wouldn't have to worry about rent. You could stay as long as you need." There was a long pause, and when she finally spoke, her voice was thick with emotion. "Michael, I don't know what to say." "Say yes," he whispered, feeling his own heart race with hope. "I don't want you to have to struggle alone." Another silence followed, but this one felt different, charged, filled with unspoken possibilities. Finally, she exhaled, a soft, trembling sound. "All right," she said quietly. I'll come stay with you." The next day, Tira arrived at Michael's house with a single duffel bag in hand, her expression a mixture of gratitude and apprehension. He met her at the door, offering her a reassuring smile, hoping to ease her uncertainty. "Welcome home," he said, the words coming out softer than he'd intended. She looked around, her silver eyes taking in the space, as if seeing it for the first time. A small smile tugged at the corners of her mouth. "Thank you, Michael, for everything." They spent the afternoon settling her in, arranging her belongings in the spare room. It was a modest space, but Michael had tried to make it comfortable, setting out fresh linens and a small vase of flowers by the window. As they worked, they slipped into an easy rhythm, their movements synchronized in a way that felt natural, like they'd known each other far longer than a few weeks. They laughed over the small things, the unpacking of clothes and the arranging of knickknacks. Every once in a while, he'd catch her looking at him with a smile, and he'd feel his heart skip a beat, a warmth blossoming in his chest. That evening, they sat together in the living room, sharing a simple meal of pasta and wine. The room was filled with a comfortable silence, a sense of peace that Michael hadn't known in a long time. He found himself glancing over at her, watching as she savored each bite, her face softened in the dim light. "This is nice," she said quietly, her gaze meeting his. "I haven't felt this safe in a long time." He reached out, placing his hand over hers, the touch gentle yet steady. "You're safe here, Tira. I promise." She looked down at their intertwined hands, her expression a mixture of gratitude and something deeper, something he couldn't quite name. "I believe you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. They sat like that, their hands joined, the silence stretching between them like an unspoken vow. It was a moment of quiet understanding, a connection that went beyond words. As the days turned into weeks, their lives intertwined in ways that felt both new and familiar. They fell into routines: morning coffees, late-night conversations, shared glances that spoke of feelings they hadn't yet voiced. And with each passing day, Michael found himself falling deeper, drawn to the kindness in her gaze, the quiet strength in her voice, and the way she seemed to understand him without needing to ask. One night, as they sat on the back porch, gazing up at the stars, Tira leaned her head on his shoulder, her hand resting gently on his arm. He felt his heart race, a warmth spreading through him as he wrapped his arm around her, pulling her closer. "Thank you, Michael," she whispered, her voice filled with emotion, "for giving me a place to belong." He turned to her, his gaze soft, filled with a tenderness he could no longer hide. "You belong here, Tira, with me." In that moment, under the vast, starry sky, they both knew that something profound had taken root between them, a love that transcended the boundaries of worlds, a bond that was stronger than anything they'd ever known. And as they held each other, wrapped in the quiet of the night, they felt a sense of peace, a promise of something beautiful yet to come. Life had settled into a warm, comforting rhythm for Michael and Tira. Every morning he'd find her sitting by the window, a cup of tea in hand, watching the sun rise with a quiet serenity that took his breath away. In these moments, he felt as though he'd stumbled upon something rare and precious, a sense of peace that filled his home and heart. Sharing the simple routines of daily life with her, he found himself constantly enchanted by her presence, by the gentleness in her movements, and by the glimmer of wonder in her silver eyes as she explored his world. For Tira, Michael's home had become her sanctuary. The spare room he'd offered her felt like her own little corner of the universe, and each day she woke up to a sense of safety and belonging she'd never imagined was possible. Earth had been difficult, a place where she'd always felt like an outsider, a curiosity. But in Michael's home she felt valued, understood, and, strange though it seemed, loved. It was a kind of warmth that went beyond words, a tenderness that had grown between them in quiet, unspoken ways. One evening, as they prepared dinner together, their movements a seamless dance around each other, Tira found herself watching him, a strange ache of longing filling her chest. She noticed the little things: the way his fingers deftly chopped vegetables, the way he smiled when he caught her gaze, the way he listened to her, truly listened, as if her words were the only ones that mattered. "Michael," she began, her voice soft, hesitant, "do you ever think about how different we are?" He looked up, his expression thoughtful. "Of course," he replied gently, putting down the knife and turning to face her fully. "But it doesn't change how I feel about you." She felt a blush rise in her cheeks, her violet skin taking on a subtle glow as she struggled to put her feelings into words. "Sometimes I worry that it's too complicated, that maybe this connection between us isn't meant to be." Michael took a step closer, reaching out to gently take her hand. The warmth of his touch sent a spark through her, a grounding sensation that chased away her doubts. "I don't care about the complications, Tira," he said, his voice steady, filled with quiet conviction. "All I know is that when I'm with you, I feel like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." She looked up at him, her silver eyes wide, vulnerable. I feel that too." In that moment, the distance between them melted away, and he lifted his hand to cup her cheek, his thumb tracing a gentle path across her skin. Her breath hitched, her heart racing as she felt his warmth seep into her, his presence anchoring her to this moment, to this man who had become her world. Slowly, she leaned into him, her eyes fluttering closed as their lips met in a kiss that was soft, tentative, a promise whispered between them. Their first kiss was like a spark igniting, a gentle merging of two souls who had been waiting for one another across worlds. She felt the sweetness of his breath, the softness of his lips, and a rush of warmth that filled her to her very core. And when they finally pulled back, they looked at each other with a newfound clarity, a silent understanding that they were bound by something far greater than either of them had anticipated. Over the weeks that followed, Michael and Tira fell deeper into each other, their bond blossoming like a flower unfurling in the warmth of spring. Their affection became woven into the fabric of their daily lives, filling every shared glance, every whispered conversation, every touch that lingered just a little longer than necessary. They discovered each other in new ways, learning the contours of each other's minds, the quiet fears and unspoken dreams that lay hidden beneath the surface. Tira would tell him stories of her childhood on her home planet, describing her family and the traditions she missed, the festivals and rituals that had been woven into the culture of her people. She told him about the way her people celebrated the changes in their sky, how they honored the cycles of their twin suns with dances that lasted until dawn. Her stories transported him to places he could only imagine, filling his mind with images of crystalline forests and luminous rivers that pulsed with their own quiet magic. In return, Michael shared pieces of his own life, opening up about the things he rarely spoke of, his struggles to find his own path, the times he'd felt lost or broken, the relationships that had left scars on his heart. He spoke of his dreams for the future, his desire to create something meaningful, and the way he'd always felt like he was waiting for something, or someone. And each time he spoke, Tira listened with an intensity that made him feel truly seen, as though she were capturing his words and holding them close, cherishing each one. They found joy in the simple, unspoken language of touch, the brush of her hand against his as they sat on the couch, the warmth of his arm around her shoulders as they watched the stars from the back porch, the way his fingers would linger on hers as he passed her a cup of tea in the mornings. These small gestures became their own kind of love letters, quiet affirmations of a bond that neither of them could put into words. One night, as they lay together on the couch, wrapped in the quiet intimacy of shared space, Tira turned to him, a question burning in her gaze. "Michael, do you ever worry about what people would think about us?" He took a deep breath, considering her question. He knew there was a risk that their relationship would be met with skepticism, judgment, perhaps even hostility from people who couldn't understand. But he looked at her, seeing the vulnerability in her expression, the hope mingled with fear, and he knew that none of that mattered. Honestly, he said, reaching out to brush a strand of hair from her face, "I don't care what anyone else thinks. What we have, it's real, Tira, and I'm willing to fight for that." Her eyes filled with emotion, a tear slipping down her cheek as she leaned into him, her voice a soft whisper. "I love you, Michael." The words settled in his heart like a balm, a declaration that felt like the answer to a question he hadn't known he was asking. He pulled her close, pressing a kiss to her forehead as he murmured, "I love you too, Tira, more than I ever thought possible." Their love became a steady, unwavering force in their lives, something that transcended the boundaries of culture, background, and even planets. And though they knew that challenges lay ahead, they faced them together, their commitment a quiet, unbreakable promise. But as their relationship deepened, so too did the challenges that came with it. They both felt the weight of the world's scrutiny, the whispered judgments of people who didn't understand. When they went out together, they often drew stares, the curious and sometimes disapproving gazes of strangers who saw only the differences between them. Tira felt the stares more keenly, each one a reminder of her own insecurities, the fear that she would never truly belong on Earth. One afternoon, after a particularly tense encounter at a grocery store where a customer had whispered something cruel under his breath, Tira returned home feeling shaken, her heart heavy with doubt. She paced the living room, her thoughts churning as she replayed the incident in her mind. Michael found her standing by the window, her arms wrapped around herself, her gaze distant and sad. He walked over, gently placing a hand on her shoulder, his presence a comforting weight. "Hey," he said softly. "Are you all right?" She shook her head, her voice tinged with frustration. "Sometimes I wonder if this was a mistake. Being here, trying to fit into a world that doesn't accept me." Michael felt a surge of anger on her behalf, a fierce protectiveness rising within him. "Tira, they don't know you. They don't know you. They don't see what I see." She turned to him, her eyes filled with pain. "What if they never do, Michael? What if I spend my whole life being treated as an outsider?" He pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly, as if he could shield her from the world's cruelty. "I don't care what they think. To me, you're perfect exactly as you are, and anyone who can't see that doesn't deserve a place in your life." She let out a soft, shaky breath, her arms tightening around him as she leaned into his warmth. His words wrapped around her heart like a shield, a reminder that she wasn't alone, that she had found a place of acceptance and love that no one could take away. As they stood there, wrapped in each other's arms, she felt a new determination blossom within her, a quiet strength that came from knowing that she was loved deeply and unconditionally. And in that moment, she realized that they could face anything as long as they were together. Their love, once a fragile, tentative thing, had become a steady, unwavering force, a light that shone brightly even in the face of darkness. They spent their days building a life together, their routines now infused with a quiet joy, a sense of belonging that went beyond words. One evening, as they sat together under the stars, Michael reached into his pocket, his heart pounding as he pulled out a small, simple ring he had found in a little antique shop. He took a deep breath, his voice steady as he spoke. "Tira, I know our love is unconventional. I know it's not easy, that there are so many challenges we'll face, but I also know that I don't want to face any of them without you. You're my home, my heart, and I want to spend the rest of my life with you." Her eyes widened, her breath catching as she looked down at the ring, her heart pounding with a joy that felt too vast to contain. She reached out, her hands trembling as she took his hand in hers. "Yes," she whispered, her voice filled with emotion. "Yes, Michael, I want that too. More than anything." In that moment, they felt the world fade away, leaving only the two of them beneath the starlit sky. They were bound by a love that transcended worlds, a bond that defied the boundaries of space and time. And as they held each other, lost in the warmth of their shared promise, they knew that they had found something rare and precious, a love that was truly out of this world. He took a deep breath, considering her question. He knew there was a risk that their relationship would be met with skepticism, judgment, perhaps even hostility from people who couldn't understand. But he looked at her, seeing the vulnerability in her expression. The hope mingled with fear, and he knew that none of that mattered. "Honestly," he said, reaching out to brush a strand of hair from her face, "I don't care what anyone else thinks. What we have, it's real, Tira, and I'm willing to fight for that." Her eyes filled with emotion, a tear slipping down her cheek as she leaned into him, her voice a soft whisper. "I love you, Michael." The words settled in his heart like a balm, a declaration that felt like the answer to a question he hadn't known he was asking. He pulled her close, pressing a kiss to her forehead as he murmured, "I love you too, Tira, more than I ever thought possible." Their love became a steady, unwavering force in their lives, something that transcended the boundaries of culture, background, and even planets. And though they knew that challenges lay ahead, they faced them together, their commitment a quiet, unbreakable promise. But as their relationship deepened, so too did the challenges that came with it. They both felt the weight of the world's scrutiny, the whispered judgments of people who didn't understand. When they went out together, they often drew stares, the curious and sometimes disapproving gazes of strangers who saw only the differences between them. Tira felt the stares more keenly, each one a reminder of her own insecurities, the fear that she would never truly belong on Earth. One afternoon, after a particularly tense encounter at a grocery store where a customer had whispered something cruel under his breath, Tira returned home feeling shaken, her heart heavy with doubt. She paced the living room, her thoughts churning as she replayed the incident in her mind. Michael found her standing by the window, her arms wrapped around herself, her gaze distant and sad. He walked over, gently placing a hand on her shoulder, his presence a comforting weight. "Hey," he said softly. "Are you all right?" She shook her head, her voice tinged with frustration. "Sometimes I wonder if this was a mistake. Being here, trying to fit into a world that doesn't accept me." Michael felt a surge of anger on her behalf, a fierce protectiveness rising within him. "Tira, they don't know you. They don't see what I see." She turned to him, her eyes filled with pain. "What if they never do, Michael? What if I spend my whole life being treated as an outsider?" He pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly, as if he could shield her from the world's cruelty. "I don't care what they think. To me, you're perfect exactly as you are, and anyone who can't see that doesn't deserve a place in your life." She let out a soft, shaky breath, her arms tightening around him as she leaned into his warmth. His words wrapped around her heart like a shield, a reminder that she wasn't alone, that she had found a place of acceptance and love that no one could take away. As they stood there, wrapped in each other's arms, she felt a new determination blossom within her, a quiet strength that came from knowing that she was loved, deeply and unconditionally. And in that moment she realized that they could face anything as long as they were together. Their love, once a fragile, tentative thing, had become a steady, unwavering force, a light that shone brightly even in the face of darkness. They spent their days building a life together, their routines now infused with a quiet joy, a sense of belonging that went beyond words. One evening, as they sat together under the stars, Michael reached into his pocket, his heart pounding as he pulled out a small, simple ring he had found in a little antique shop. He took a deep breath, his voice steady as he spoke. "Ira, I know our love is unconventional. I know it's not easy, that there are so many challenges we'll face, but I also know that I don't want to face any of them without you. You're my home, my heart, and I want to spend the rest of my life with you." Her eyes widened, her breath catching, as she looked down at the ring, her heart pounding with a joy that felt too vast to contain. She reached out, her hands trembling as she took his hand in hers. "Yes," she whispered, her voice filled with emotion. "Yes, Michael, I want that too, more than anything." In that moment, they felt the world fade away, leaving only the two of them beneath the starlit sky. They were bound by a love that transcended worlds, a bond that defied the boundaries of space and time. And as they held each other, lost in the warmth of their shared promise, they knew that they had found something rare and precious, a love that was truly out of this world. The morning sun filtered through the curtains, casting soft golden hues across the room where Michael and Tira lay entwined, their breaths even and peaceful in the quiet dawn. For a moment, Michael simply watched her, admiring the way the light caught her violet skin, making it glow with a soft luminescence that never failed to leave him mesmerized. It was moments like this, in the gentle silence of morning, that he realized just how precious these days with her had become, how deeply he wanted their life together to be forever. Tira stirred, her silver eyes opening slowly, a gentle smile spreading across her face as she saw him watching her. "Good morning," she murmured, her voice warm, her gaze soft. "Good morning," he whispered back, reaching out to tuck a strand of hair behind her ear, his fingers lingering at her cheek. "I could get used to mornings like this." She laughed softly, her smile widening. "So could I." She shifted closer, pressing a soft kiss to his cheek before resting her head on his shoulder, a contented sigh escaping her. "I don't think I've ever felt this at peace, Michael." He held her close, his heart swelling with an emotion so deep he could barely put it into words. "Me neither," he murmured, his voice a soft, reverent whisper. "I never knew it was possible to feel this way. You've changed my life, Tira, in ways I can't even explain." They lay like that for a while, savoring the quiet intimacy between them, until the world outside began to stir with the sounds of morning. Reluctantly, they rose to face the day, falling into their usual routines, but even in the small tasks of making breakfast and brewing coffee, there was a sense of togetherness that made everything feel like a shared ritual. Over the past weeks, Tira had begun to feel truly at home here, her world expanding in small, precious ways that gave her a sense of belonging she had once thought impossible. She loved their routines, The quiet way they moved around each other in the kitchen, the shared laughter, the way he always saved her the last sip of his coffee, even when she insisted she didn't want it. But despite the peaceful rhythm they'd created, both knew there were still challenges they had to face. The outside world wasn't as welcoming as the cocoon they'd woven together. Each time they went out in public, there were the inevitable stares, the whispers, the unkind glances that reminded them both of the reality they lived in. Tira would often tense under the weight of those looks, feeling the sting of judgment, but Michael would always reach for her hand, a quiet reassurance that grounded her, his touch a reminder that she wasn't alone. One afternoon, they decided to venture into the heart of the city for a rare outing, a visit to a small art gallery that Tira had been curious about. She loved art, especially pieces that depicted the night sky, finding comfort in the familiar sight of stars, even though they were different from those of her home world. As they walked through the gallery, Tira found herself entranced by a painting that depicted an ethereal night sky, the colors deep and swirling, capturing a sense of vastness and mystery that resonated with her soul. "It reminds me of the skies back home," she murmured, her voice filled with a quiet longing as she gazed at the painting. Michael wrapped his arm around her shoulders, drawing her close. "Tell me about it," he said gently, his voice filled with a warmth that made her heart ache. She smiled, her gaze softening as she looked up at him. "The stars on my planet are brighter, more vibrant. They feel closer, like you could reach out and touch them. And there are 2 moons, each with their own light, casting long shadows across the forests. Nights there are filled with songs, music played by my people. Honoring the cycles of the moon," she paused, a wistful look crossing her face. "Sometimes I miss it. But being here with you, it feels like home in a different way." He leaned down, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead. "You're my home too, Tira," he whispered. They lingered by the painting, lost in each other's presence, but their moment was soon interrupted by the murmurs of people nearby. Michael heard someone whispering, his voice low but loud enough to carry. "Look at that. Is that an alien? And with a human too?" Another voice chimed in, a hint of disdain in her tone. "It's unnatural. They don't belong together." Michael felt Tira tense beside him, her posture stiffening as she heard the words. He tightened his grip on her shoulder, anger flaring within him as he glanced over at the small group who were now openly staring at them, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and disapproval.